Welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Seventh-day Adventist mission to the world. To find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org.
We're so glad that you joined us. I'm Sam Neves.
And I'm David Trim, and in this episode we're joined again by Dr. Michael Campbell, Director of the North American Division Office of Archives, Statistics and Research, and a widely published author on Adventist history.
Thanks for having me. Privileged to be back.
Welcome back. We were so inspired with your story.
When we talked last episode.
Yeah, how you were a missionary in Asia and so on. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the people that are reached through those missions.
Michael, today we're going to be talking about mission in those islands of the South Pacific, and in particular about how local converts became vital in spreading the Seventh-day Adventist message. Now, in episode 8, we talked with Dr. Barry Oliver about the early years of Seventh-day Adventist mission in Australia and the South Pacific, and when we talked with him, we included discussing the construction and launching of the mission ship Pitcairn in 1890, which was instrumental in spreading Adventism to the small islands of the Pacific. But we didn't have time to go into detail about the Pitcairn in that episode, so Michael, tell us, when it departed San Francisco Bay on October 20, 1890, where did the Pitcairn go on its first voyage?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in fact, I think my first discussion with you, gentlemen, in this series was about Abram LaRue, right?
Yes.
So it's going across the Pacific. People are just passionate about wanting to share the Adventist message. And so it starts percolating its way across the different islands. First, the Sandwich Islands to Hawaii, right? Cool. And then by the latter part of the mid-1880s, 1886, you have John Tay, and he takes a boat that goes across and eventually makes his way to Pitcairn Island. And he had been a sailor when he was a young person, so he kind of had heard about it as kind of this exotic tale of the mutiny on the Bounty and all of this stuff, and managed to convince a ship captain to let him off briefly, because the ship captain was sure that he would either die or something terrible would happen to him. And he goes onto the island, befriends the people there, and in fact, he ends up stays long enough that they are excited about what he has to share with them. And he says, well, I need to come back and bring a pastor to baptize the people and organize a church and everything else. Well, that's 1886. It's 5 years later before they actually have the Pitcairn ship.
4 years.
Excuse me, 4 years. And plus the travel time over there too, right? So, but it's this lag that's really quite a challenge for them.
Well, and as we heard with Barry Oliver, it was built by donations from church members across North America. So obviously, but yes.
First major Sabbath school project.
Right.
In a way.
And children donating money and all kinds of things. So that took a little while, but October 20, 1890 is when it takes its first voyage.
Exactly. And so there's a small group, and we have different accounts of it. It's launched at a camp meeting, so they have all the church members in California, many of whom had donated funds for this. They get on the boat. They have a special dedication ceremony. It goes out into the bay. In fact, Ellen White is there. She goes out on a tour of the bay on the Pitcairn as it's going around, and eventually they let everybody off. And then it's
except
just
the missionaries,
except for the crew and and we're told that there was also a parrot, a little parrot that was on board, and on that ship was a Adventist missionary family, John Fulton and his wife, and they had their oldest daughter, and she was just a baby. So we're told that there is this little infant and this parrot as they're going through San Francisco Bay. The Golden Gate Bridge isn't even built yet, right? You just imagine that going out there into the Pacific Ocean. As they look back, they realize, oh, they're embarking on something very significant, and it will go to a number of places, of course.
But with them was John Tay, right?
John Tay. We'll talk about
amongst the missionaries who went was not only the Fultons but John Tay.
John Tay, and he was the ship carpenter. So he volunteered as part of the crew. So he's like, hey, I'm going to make sure that this ship really makes it. And by the way, there's a little backstory there that there had been a previous attempt and a ship had sunk. Tragic story. So now they realized, okay, we need to actually invest a little bit more significantly, have a proper seaworthy vessel. But now there's John Tay. Thankfully, he didn't go down with the previous attempt. But so he's on his way with his wife. So there's a crew. There's the missionaries, and so John Tay. Yes, first stop they want to make is Pitcairn Island, so they can organize that church. They can have the baptisms that they had.
The island
people have been waiting.
The island the ship has been named after.
Indeed, the very one. And so it will continue on from there. It's not going to just stay at Pitcairn. It's going to go on to the Society Islands. It's going to go to Tonga, what we today call the Cook Islands, Samoa, the Norfolk Islands, and Fiji, which we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about, I hope.
Let's pause for a little bit. Why did we build a ship? Wouldn't it be easier and better just to send people in regular ships that are going in those directions? What was the thinking, as far as you can tell?
Well, so firstly, if you want to go to Pitcairn, it's very difficult because it's not on a regular shipping route. Ships do stop there periodically, but it's not on well-trafficked shipping routes. And also, if you think about places like Tonga, the Cook Islands, the Society Islands, or what today we would call French Polynesia,
right?
These are all places, again, that aren't necessarily on the direct shipping routes from America. So, for example, when Ellen White goes to Australia in 1891, she goes via American Samoa. It goes from San Francisco to American Samoa to New Zealand and Australia. So if you want to go to Samoa as a missionary, it's very easy because America has a colony in Samoa. But if you're wanting to go to these other islands, then it's not going to be so easy to go from America. From Australia, there would be more opportunities. But so if you're wanting to send missionaries direct from America to reach these places, and this is, by the mid-1890s, Ellen White is in Australia. She's visited Samoa herself. She's aware that there's this mission field here, and she keeps writing about the need to take the message to the islands of the sea. She talks about China, India, and the islands of the sea. So in other words, talking about, and we've discussed this in a previous podcast, Sam, we're talking about non-Christian religions.
Yeah.
And so if you want to go to the islands of the sea, you almost have to have your own ship that can make its own itinerary and can chart its own course.
I wonder about their craziness with this, because you've got, there are not millions of them.
No, there's tens of thousands at most.
Yes, and they're absolutely driven. I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to build a ship is what we're going to do.
Yep.
And then well, how are we going to pay for it? Well, people are going to give. Mm-hmm. That boldness.
Right.
At the impossibility.
Almost, we talked about this when we talked with Barry Oliver, actually. I rewatched that episode as we were preparing for this, and we talked about how they were almost reckless.
Yes, that's what it seems.
Their boldness was almost verged on recklessness, except, of course, that it's not recklessness because they have faith.
Yeah.
And that faith helps them to make the sacrifices necessary.
Yes.
Because focus is the byproduct of sacrifice. You cannot sacrifice if you don't know where you're going and what you're focusing on.
Yeah.
They want to reach every single person in the world, and those islands are not going to be left behind. So what do we need to sacrifice to make sure that happens? Well, let's give so we can build a ship that will get us there.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely remarkable. So today we have airplanes, right? That go from island to island, and
we have missionary airplanes as well. Yeah. But today, of course, it's much easier because the world is better connected.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to get our missionaries to places than it was 130 years ago.
Yeah. To make the point, though, I think that you're making, David, that it's not always easy to get, for example, to Tonga. There's no direct flights from Washington, D.C. to Tonga. You're going to have to probably fly somewhere on the West Coast and then somewhere, maybe in Japan or Korea or China, and then make another flight and then probably still make yet another flight.
On Tuesdays, because that's the only day it goes there.
On Tuesday, depending. And and so that's still the challenge, although it just took longer with boats back then. Now, there is something interesting because in the early 20th century, by the time the Pitcairn ship will eventually be retired, it'd be largely because there will be new routes that make it much cheaper and efficient with the ships to go. But at this point, there's not really, and this is a bold venture because it's not just any boat. This is a boat that can cross the Pacific. And there will be other boats, many, many missionary boats later, but usually they're a different kind of boat that goes between islands.
Right. So in the South Pacific, for example, they still, and in fact, there's a very good article in the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists about missionary boats in the South Pacific.
Yeah.
But they are operating just offshore and going between islands. As Michael rightly says, the Pitcairn has to cross the Pacific, which means it has to be a ship of a certain size and of a certain robustness, because the Pacific gets, even though it's called Pacific, gets very pronounced storms and there's vast distances to cross. So saying you're going to have your own ship to go to the Pacific is a much bigger thing than if you were to say, for example, we'll build a ship in New Orleans to take us to the Caribbean.
I never had that connection with the Pacific and pace, the Latin word for peace.
Yes.
Yes, it's definitely not very peaceful. Okay, so we found ourselves in Fiji now.
We're in Fiji, that's right.
What happens?
So we got the Fultons, John and Agnes and their whole family. Eventually they'll have 3 children that are born there. In fact, John will be considered so significant to the work and formation. Actually, John Tay, let's follow up the story and connect the dots just a little bit. He actually will be dropped off first.
In Pitcairn.
In Fiji. He's there in Pitcairn, but eventually they organize the church. It's, they spend some time, several weeks and even months going between different islands,
so this
right?
isn't a 6-hour stop. They spend a few months there, establish a church.
They do. They spend some time. And so eventually John Tay and his wife will stop first in Fiji, and he will succumb to, they think it was most likely some kind of influenza. I mean, how do you really know? But he will tragically die. In fact, he's buried there. His grave is there. His wife will eventually, after that, she'll, I think she goes to Australia, as I recall. And then, and of course, she has her own story and everything else. After his death, they're kind of circling back around, right? And so they realize this tragedy has taken place. They will drop off the Fulton family to kind of continue to follow up on those early efforts.
So these are not just stopovers, even if they're long ones, where the ship goes to a place, the missionaries get off for a few days or maybe even a few weeks, conduct mission evangelistic work, and then say, no, we're leaving now.
Yeah.
They're actually leaving. The Pitcairn is not just a cruise vessel, which has exotic holidays.
Right.
Not obviously that I'm being sarcastic there. And we think about Tay. And we had an episode about missionaries in the South Pacific dying of various fevers.
Yeah.
So but the Pitcairn is not like a cruise vessel. It's actually a courier vessel to take people to island fields, drop them off where they will remain.
Yes, indeed. So and those early days when missionaries were dropped off, it wasn't like, okay, we'll be back in 12 months. Most people wrote about how when they were going with the intention of spending the rest of their lives. There was no return trip. And in fact, the only return trip would be for reinforcements. And so not the first voyage, but in subsequent voyages of the Pitcairn, that it would even bring building materials, because sometimes they couldn't find enough materials to build with. And so literally the deck of the Pitcairn was filled with beams of wood and other kinds of supplies that was then being couriered back to these different mission outposts. And so this is very significant. In fact, sometimes people said that the voyage was so terrible that not only was it unlikely that there would be a return trip, nobody wanted the return trip either. But that's just how it was. And so, but now the Fultons are in Fiji. They're picking up the work of the sacrifice of John Tay and his wife that are there, and they're picking up the pieces. And initially, people don't want to talk to them. They're kind of, there's who are these people? Even the other foreigners, the expatriates that are there, are kind of suspicious. Who are Seventh-day Adventists? Who do you think you are? We already have missionaries here, right? So they're feeling a little threatened.
Methodists, particularly.
Indeed, especially there, and so there's friction not only of the natives but of the other expats. And so and it takes some time for them to build the rapport, the relationships. And Agnes will find that rapport building when she starts taking care of people that are sick and people need some help. So instead of being shunned like they had been, people realize, oh, these Adventists actually have some interesting ideas about health and healing that could be helpful and help people get better again. And so that's one significant step. The other significant step will be they're not going to wait wait for other missionaries and other expats to listen to them. They're going to look and seek out opportunities to share their faith with the local indigenous peoples there. And that's going to be a groundbreaking, a very momentous thing for them. But again, it takes several years. Again, missionary work, when it's done right, and I think we could all think of examples where it's not done right, but when it's done well, and I think this is a good case study where it was done well, it happens organically, and it takes time to build that rapport, to build the kind of thing, the relationship, so people see that they truly love and care about the people. And there's always a suspicion of imperialism, right? There's the traders that are going through trying to take advantage of people. And again, the Fultons and others that I've studied, Adventist missionaries find it very frustrating when there are these other competing interests of tradespeople, traders who tend to take advantage, try to get as much money as they can, and exploiting, right? And then you also have military ships too, right? They're through just sheer force. And so you have those other elements, and so it's very easy for our missionaries who may have absolutely nothing to do with either of those elements. I'm not saying that they didn't ever
conflated with them.
Conflated, and so they had to be able to separate.
They're Westerners. They're agents of imperialism or agents of exploitation, or both.
Exactly.
Much of that is much of that fear is mitigated by adapting to the local culture.
Indeed.
And learning from and living as the local people.
Learning the language, eating the food. Those seem to be two things, and I can now speak a little bit from personal experience too here. And this is true of the Tays. John Tay, they say, mastered the Fijian language so well that he was so, even with his accent, that he could speak, they thought, like a local person that had grown up there. And so that's something very, I mean, that's quite a compliment. Rare. That's a rare compliment. And then also they learned to eat the foods. Sometimes they struggled a little bit with that, but they learned to begin to appreciate, especially the tropical fruits, right? The mangoes and things like that, where they were able to learn to empathize with the local people.
Every missionary has stories of food issues that they go through, right? When I first went to England, not as a missionary, I went to study. That someone invited me to a Christmas dinner.
Yes.
And I saw these wonderful little cabbages. They looked lovely. I had never seen Brussels sprouts before in my life. I took loads of them, and I couldn't speak English to say I'm not going to finish eating because I don't like them politely. So I ended up eating the whole thing. So I'm sure they went through experiences of food.
They did. But I like to collect stories of our early missionaries. I've been collecting these for a while now. And as they first tried durian, which is this very pungent, odoriferous fruit, and so I found quite a few now right away that missionaries, they recognized, and some really liked it and some didn't.
Hated it. Yeah, sure. I am sure that was the case then as it is now, because people may change, but durian has not changed.
It hasn't changed
since then.
Durian has not changed.
Something to note though is that sometimes there wasn't always enough food. You'd be in these very remote places. There's no grocery store to get food, and sometimes when there were times of famine, that that's may have contributed to Tay's death, that he didn't have quite enough nourishment, why he was more susceptible to disease. Certainly the Fultons experienced some extreme famine at times when there were droughts, there wasn't enough food. Obviously there's always fish in the Pacific, but sometimes the fish are not always as plentiful as one might like to think, right? And so there can be times of hunger, and that was, and when people see that, and something very interesting is when the Fultons, and this is powerful, they take what little food they had and they would share. They would share. And so I think when people see that, instead of it being, oh, hey, they're trying to take advantage of us, when they're willing to share out of what little they have, they see, oh, these people are different. There's something different about them. And again, missionaries weren't always perfect, but those are the moments of truth, we might say, right? Or the reality wake up, and it's those kinds of moments that people began to see, oh, I want to pay attention to what they're talking about.
So Fulton and John and Agnes Fulton and their child arrive, they adapt to the local culture, they eventually start to make friends. These are an absolutely crucial and indispensable part of the missionary's work. But what about Fulton's work in what might be more classically thought of as missionary work? Say, for example, translating literature and developing opportunities for print.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is always a big thing for Adventists.
Absolutely, the power of print, right? And we see there's certain patterns in mission history, right? So missionaries will come. Usually there'll be some self-supporting missionaries that kind of go on their own, and then there's the official missionaries that follow up, and then soon after there's an established presence after a church and evangelism, you'll start to see schools. You'll see publishing houses, and you'll see clinics, and they sometimes will go in slightly different order depending on who the missionaries are and where they are. But right away you see efforts by Fulton. He's particularly strong. Obviously, his wife is doing nursing work, so that's an immediate connection. But that one of his earliest attempts was to start a periodical. A little circular that begins to be distributed, that's translated into the Fijian language. He also starts translating a number of different tracts, including some earliest attempts at translating some of Ellen White's writings, some sections of Great Controversy, and some writings about the Sabbath, a little tract on the Sabbath. And that's how he starts actually making connections with a young pastor or former pastor who's now kind of become discouraged, Pagliassi. We'll talk about him, I hope.
Yes.
But he kind of pulls him in a little bit, asking him to help translate some of these tracts, because initially he's kind of reticent, and he says, well, maybe if I have you help me translate some of this, we can, I'll pay you, right? And so he's reading and translating some of this literature, and that's a first point of contact.
Right.
In fact, let's go into this guy.
Pagliassi, yeah.
Yeah. What's did he
Tell us,
come?
yeah.
Did he come in the ship? What? Where is he from? Who is he?
Yeah, so we know a little bit about his story. We actually know about his, thanks to a number of different accounts from different people, including himself, where he shared some of his story. His family actually were initially converted from the first missionaries that came to the Fijian Islands. David Cargill, William Cross, they come to Fiji in 1835. In fact, his family will be persecuted as they accept the Christian faith and have to flee into the mountains, the caves, from their villages where they are kind of eschewed. And eventually they will make their way back. They will be accepted, and those early missionaries, especially the Methodists that we talked about, will make a significant presence. And as a young man, he grows up, and so the Methodist missionaries say, we need more missionaries from these islands, because we know you, to help us convert people in other islands. And so he will go on this missionary experiment on the John Wesley with a man by the name of Methodist, intrepid Methodist missionary leader, George Brown, who will then take this group and they will go to what was then called New Ireland, or what we now know as the northeastern corner of Papua New Guinea. And he will go in 1875. Now, tragically, you admire that attempt of what was going on. His family will die of disease. Some will drown until he's the only one left in his family. His wife, his children, all tragically die. And that's why I say he's a discouraged, somewhat former minister, because he returns home just, thoroughly having just gone through this very challenging, that's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. And he will kind of be putting his life back together when he meets John Fulton. He actually will get remarried. He has children again with his new wife. And that's when it's at that point of where he's kind of piecing his life back together, that he is open and these points of contact occur. Now, Pagliassi, one of my favorite stories in Adventist mission history.
Oh, wow.
Because what happens is that Fulton, again, he's having trouble trying to reach out and make points of connection, and hasn't really had any converts yet, right? And Pagliassi will, he will be bold, Fulton that is, and start holding meetings. And Pagliassi hears, they become friends, translating a tract. He goes to the meeting, the opening night, and he goes every single night, doesn't miss a night. When he gets done, he says, I want to be baptized. He's all in. And people are kind of wondering, have you been duped by the Adventist missionary? What's wrong with you? If you become Adventist, they start threatening him that you will, we're gonna you know, do bad things to you. And so he's like, well, maybe I'm going to have to flee to the mountains like his father had, right? Many years earlier.
But now from other Christians or from?
From other Christians. Can you imagine? Yeah, that sometimes
the
people...
persecuted becomes the persecutor.
Yes.
It wouldn't be the first time.
No.
It's a crazy thing, but it's a phenomena
Yeah.
we've seen happen many times, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he makes a decision that he wants to be baptized, and it's at that moment, at the end of those evangelistic meetings, that one of his other friends, Ambrose, who I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but he will take sides, and he'll hear enough. He'll hear enough that Pagliassi will share what he's learning with his friend Ambrose, and that he will lead his dear friend, who is of royal descent, this chief, that and the two of them will convert together. Now,
oh, wow.
He leads him to Christ, and they say, okay, what are we going to do? Now it's pouring down rain. There's a couple of different accounts of this, pouring down rain, a tropical downpour. And so he's led Ambrose to Christ. Pagliassi has now made this decision. They say, well, what do we do? Because obviously the villagers are very unhappy with them, and the two of them walk in the rain early on a Sabbath morning through a couple of miles, all uphill through the jungle. And the Fultons had kind of gotten discouraged. Here they had held these meetings. Was anyone going to make a decision for Christ? Here they'd done all this effort again and again and again. Didn't seem to have any fruits. And in the middle of this tropical storm, this downpour, here show up Pagliassi and Ambrose, and they're knocking on the door. Please, we want to be baptized. So this is a turning point in the history of Adventism in Fiji. So now it's not just people have come from a different place, but now it is being indigenized, incarnationalized, as now local people see there's something special here. We want what you have, and have committed their life to Christ. And now to the point where they say, the Sabbath, we're going to start keeping the Sabbath. And in fact, Pagliassi, now he's a pastor, right? Or has been.
How old are they at this point?
Well, Pagliassi he was born around the 1840s, so he's what, 50s maybe.
So he's not a young chicken,
We don't know for sure. Obviously, we don't have a definite birth date. And Ambrose is probably roughly about the same age too. They're friends. They're obviously friends. And actually, when they come back, there's a question: do we go back to our villages? Well, the Ambrose is like, I'm the high chief here, no one's. And so two things happen. First, Pagliassi, his other Methodist minister friends, they challenge him, say, how dare you start keeping the Sabbath? And he says, well, and again, we have a couple of different accounts of this, but they're all the same idea. He says, well, show me from the Bible one text of Scripture where that I should keep Sunday, and then I will go back to my old ways keeping Sunday. But right now, the Bible says Sabbath, the seventh day is the Sabbath, and I can show you lots of examples where the Bible says this. So unless you can show me from Scripture, and they say, well, you haven't experienced the power of God and the power of holiness. And he says, I'm not asking about the power of holiness, I'm asking Scripture. And he couldn't provide him a scripture. He says, well, I'm going to keep keeping the seventh-day Sabbath till you give me a scripture verse. And Ambrose does something a little bit different, because he's worried not from a scriptural point of view, but from a power, a political, because he's a high chief, right? One of the descendant of the former king and everything else. So what he does is he arranges a council and asks all the lower chiefs that are on their island to come at this council. He sits them down and he basically explains to them, and again, I'm using my own words here, but basically the idea that I believe this on my own free will, my own volition. I have not been tricked by the Adventist missionaries. They're not forcing me to do anything.
Brainwashing here.
Yeah. So he basically says, this is really good for you. I believe it with all my heart, and these missionaries are good people. Now, when the high chief, Ambrose, says this, not everyone converts, but at that point, everyone says, and that becomes a turning point, after which Adventism really spreads like wildfire across the Fijian Islands.
So we've talked about Pagliassi and Ratu Ambrose. Ratu is a Fijian word that means chief.
That's right.
One more notable early convert was Ratu Meli.
Yes.
So Tell us about Ratu Mele.
So this is kind of a fun mission story that one of the things you notice are patterns where different peoples, different cultures will experience and be converted for different reasons, right? We know that some people had dreams, sometimes visions. We don't know exactly what all that was, but some kind of revelation. And in this case, this is a really incredible story where his father had been, again, an early convert of the Christian missionaries. Now, he's about 80 miles away in a different island. But his father, before he passed away, said there will be some missionaries that come that will teach you from the Bible and will also teach you about the seventh-day Sabbath.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so when, now many years later, he meets these missionaries and they're keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, so I have to know what it is that you have to teach because my father told me that you're going to come. And so again, we don't have all the details. All we know is his account. His father had told him this, but some kind of God speaking to people in different ways. We know in Romans it talks about this, that God reveals himself through nature and through different peoples and different times and places that sometimes may even surprise us. I think this is one of those surprising moments. And
Indeed.
you can imagine the missionaries, like when they finally heard, one of those wow moments. But again, you see something very significant happening. And so as the literature is being translated, as medical work continues, and significantly, Fulton will be the one who establishes a small little press, a little hand press. So it kind of echoes back to James White, in Rochester,
Yeah.
Here they have in the middle of the Pacific, and Ellen White had this vision that you talked about, David, about how the Isles of the Sea, right here in the middle of the ocean, is the first real Adventist printing establishment. Now, there'll be many more later in different places in Australia and all over the place, but this will be the first one in the Isles of the Sea, specifically fulfilling the vision that Ellen White said. And so they will eventually bring another press. They'll build a building for it. Others will come and help to staff it. There's a young lady from Avondale. She will come, and she's really the one that helps to take what John Fulton started and builds it up even more. So there's a whole series of great stories here. But you see some incredible steps that have been made, formative steps in establishing an Adventist presence here.
These are great stories, Michael, but let's go back, pull back the vision from individuals for a moment. What you've described is how some key local people have been converted, and then, as you said a little earlier, the Adventist message starts to spread like wildfire. So, and there aren't that many missionaries, which means the message must be being indigenized. There's a slightly ugly word, but what we mean is that the indigenous people, local people. So it's no longer just down to the missionary, it's local people who are taking on the preaching of the message. Having looked at those individual stories, which are wonderful and inspiring, as we look at indigenization in Fiji, what patterns can be discerned?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I think this is one of the vital things of Adventist mission identity and story is this very thing of indigenization, because I think there is this traditional narrative of colonialism, and we haven't been completely immune from that either. I mean, if we go back and look at it, but you do see an intentional effort by those early missionaries that they realized the most effective people to reach their own people through the culture and the language and everything else were their own people. And so why not train them? Pagliassi, he'll become the first Fijian Seventh-day Adventist ordained minister. And there will be many more who will follow in his wake. But once Pagliassi, who's a passionate preacher, once he starts holding evangelistic meetings. Now, John Fulton's called the apostle to the Fijian Islands because he loved the people and preached the Adventist message. But man, Pagliassi, there's no comparison to the incredible effectiveness of his evangelism. He knows how to explain it in a way that the people can understand. And of course, by the way, what's interesting is Pagliassi and Fulton and these missionaries, they had such close relationships. So it wasn't like, one usurping power over the other. They were the best of friends, would protect each other's, sacrifice their lives for each other, and sometimes did, right? I mean, they would protect each other, they would look out for each other, but my goodness, Pagliassi, you see that, and you see the others, like Ambrose, of course, he's a chief, he's not a preacher, but that once they lend their influence. So there is this process of authentically and incarnationally taking the Adventist message. And there is a biblical truth here. I mean, that's what Jesus did, right? I mean, that's what missionary work. Jesus came and incarnated himself as a human being to show us, and of course to be our Savior and to die on Calvary and everything else. But there is that incarnational moment. What missionaries at their best do is to be incarnational. And so that's what I love. And that process, the result of that process is that Adventism looks a little bit different in different places of the world. They discovered that because it's a different culture, you know, and there's humorous stories. If you read Fulton's Footprints in Fiji, Eric B. Hare, who would later be Fulton's son-in-law, he would write these great stories of his father-in-law and his missionary endeavors. All of these together, that you just see these patterns of authentically, sometimes humorous too, because Fulton, he talks about in his autobiography, and then his son-in-law writes about it, how he would go in and struggle to eat the food. It wasn't that he didn't like the food, but he saw the way it was being made, and people had different hygiene standards than maybe what he was used to. And then he saw people stamping in the food with their feet and everything. And he says how he quickly began to lose his appetite, but he didn't want to offend them. So he's praying, Lord, please help me. But then he realizes, okay, maybe I just need to go back to the boat right away and feign and plead. He just can't do it. He literally can't stomach it, but he knows what he needs to do. And despite whatever challenges and even setbacks and even at times even mistakes, people saw that they loved the people. And as he loved the people, and as they saw incarnationally them sharing the Adventist message, that message then is transmitted into a new culture. And Adventism, it does look different in different parts of the world. It doesn't mean that Adventism is bad, because it's different from what you and I might expect. Just like how we keep the Sabbath. I shared in the previous episode. I had to learn different ways of keeping the Sabbath. But we could then respectfully say, oh, within that culture and the way they understand things, this is a way that they can honor God through keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, and they can honor and take that message. And so it's still authentically the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Seventh-day Adventist message, but now it is being shared in ways that Ellen White and James White and the earliest pioneers in America and in North American context probably would have never imagined. But it is authentically Adventist, and it's fulfilling the message and mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church all the way back to Revelation 14. And that's still what we have to do until Jesus comes. We have the privilege to continue doing that same kind of thing. But when we recognize, we see those patterns going on, I just want to make this point for emphasis, is that when the local people, in the indigenization, or for lack of a better term, or that incarnational process, once that happens, Adventism always seems to be able to be more effectively transmitted.
Yes.
And that is you just see that happen again and
less
again.
barriers for communication.
Yeah.
So we've got media, publishing at the time, but now
Print,
different media today. Health, education, serving the church, and vice versa.
Yeah.
What happened to education in Fiji?
I'm glad we didn't leave without talking about that, because they're in Berrylaesa. They're right at the where they first settled and set up the initial mission station. Ambrose will donate the land for a new mission station that has a little bit more space to establish a school. And that will become the initial training school. Now, sometime later, a couple decades later, I think it's the 1920s, in fact, they will actually the denomination will buy a bigger piece of property that will then become a college. Today we call it Fulton College, named in honor of...
In fact, the church didn't buy it. They took out a 99-year lease.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay.
And so about 15 years ago, the entire college had to be moved because the owners refused to sell the land or extend the 99 years. Of course, they thought 99 years, Christ
more than enough. More than
enough time that we need.
Yeah.
And so about 15 years ago, the church had to move Fulton College completely to an entirely new site. But Fulton College,
I didn't even know that.
Fulton College is still there, but it's
as an entity.
As an entity, but it's now on a completely different site because they took out a lease instead of buying the property.
No.
Wow.
Well, that legacy, though, of education, Sam, continues on. And so there continue to be pastors that are trained there and many other people. And again, they don't have to necessarily go all the way to some other faraway country. That people can go there to school.
It serves the islands, therefore.
It serves the islands. They can receive a quality Seventh-day Adventist education, and we can train church workers, pastors, and teachers to continue carrying that legacy on.
And you're not sending them away to some other culture where they may lose contact with their own culture and no longer be able to be effective ministers in the Fijian context.
Indeed.
So we're running out of time, Michael. We could talk about this a lot more, but let's come back to the ship Pitcairn. What happened to the ship?
Well, as we were talking about in the beginning, how shipping began to become more regularized between the different islands, church leaders analyzed what it cost to maintain the ship Pitcairn and realized it was more cost-effective within about a 10-year period that shipping and transportation had changed so much that was going to be a better way to go. And so they realized they didn't need to maintain a ocean seaworthy vessel, and so they voted to sell it. So they went ahead. There was a merchant in Manila where it was at the time. They sold it as a merchant vessel. And then shortly thereafter, I don't remember the exact date, but soon afterwards, there was a typhoon and it had taken off rather ill-informed. They thought they could outrun the typhoon in the Philippines. And it sank off of the island of Mindoro, which is just the island south of.
So it's sunk there somewhere.
It's sunk there somewhere. I tell you, Sam, I love Adventist heritage sites, and I love scuba diving, and I've done.
It's meant to be, Michael.
Well,
it's meant to be.
I made a number of trips down to Mindoro to scuba dive. I haven't found it yet, but maybe
the explorers out there.
An Adventist version of a National Geographic expedition to go off the coast of Mindoro. Maybe one day we'll find it.
I can see the documentary, Finding Pitcairn.
Don't you think that'd make a great special on Hope Channel?
It would be good. Very good. Well, Dr. Michael Campbell, thank you for joining us in Mission 150.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure you'll be back at some point with great stories. God has really gifted you.
Always a pleasure.
With this gift of storytelling. It's great. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Mission 150. Please keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or listening on your favorite podcast platform. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. If you want to know more about Adventist missionary work and missionaries today, go to AdventistMission.org. That's AdventistMission.org. And if you want to find mission opportunities today, go to VividFaith.com. We'll be back next week with more on the inspiring history of Adventist mission around the world.